The Tissue Level of Organization, Chapter 4. Okay, so if you have noticed, we've been going up the hierarchy of life. We started in Chapter 2 with the atom and the molecule. Then in Chapter 3, we went into the organelle and the cell. And when we group cells together, we make tissues, which is what this chapter is about. And then we'll go on from there to talk about individual organs and organ systems that make up the organism. So tissues are defined as collections of specialized cells and their products that will perform very specific functions or jobs. Tissues that group together will form organs like the heart or liver or lungs. Histology is the study of tissues. So there are 4 main types of tissues in the human body, and we can fit just about everything into one of these 4. They are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and finally nervous tissue. We are going to focus mainly on the first 2 in this chapter. We will make a reference to muscle, and then later we'll go much more in depth in muscle when we get into the muscle chapter, and we will get in detail with nervous tissue as well a little further on in the course. So epithelial tissue, just in general, we're going to go into it in great detail after we give a little overview. This is what we're going to find covering exposed body surfaces as well as internal passageways. So epithelial tissue lines or covers the human body, and it can also form glands. Connective tissue is going to fill spaces inside your body. It supports other tissues, transports materials, and also stores energy, and mostly in the form of fat. Muscle tissue is specialized to contract and does include 3 main types of muscle: skeletal, heart or cardiac, and smooth muscle, which is what we find lining hollow organs. Nervous tissue is going to carry electrical signals from one part of the body to another. So again, we'll revisit those a little bit at the end of the chapter, but in great detail when we get into their individual chapters. So this chart is a nice overview of the 4 tissue types. This would be a good screenshot if you want to refer to it later. So again, looking at our hierarchy of life, we have the individual cell, which secretes extracellular material, so that would be the material outside of the cell, and fluid. This material and fluid is what helps the cells stick to each other in combination to form tissues. Tissues can be divided up into 4 categories. Epithelial, which we talked about is going to cover and line body surfaces. Connective, which is found filling internal spaces, giving support and storing energy, mainly in the form of fat. Muscle tissue for contraction, and nervous tissue to carry information and send signals. If we combine all 4 of those tissues, we create organs, which interact with accessories or other organs to form organ systems. So let's focus in on the first type, epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is the one we talked about that lines and covers all body surfaces. So the one that you can see really easily would be your skin, the part of your skin that you can touch. That's considered a type of epithelial tissue. And then if you think of specific organs inside the body, like the lining of the intestines or the lining of the stomach or esophagus, those would all be lined with epithelia as well. So it's going to also include epithelial tissue, will also include glands, and depending on where we are in the body, those glands are going to change. For example, if we're talking about the epithelia in the skin, then the glands we would think of maybe would be oil glands or sweat glands. If we're thinking of the epithelia that lines the intestines, then those glands might be mucus glands. Okay, so epithelia, again, layers of cells that cover internal or external surfaces. They are also going to help make glands, which are structures that produce fluids. Again, that's going to vary depending on what gland we're talking about. So if we think about the fact that epithelia lines and covers body surfaces, one of the first functions of epithelia we might think of would be protection, especially when we're talking about the skin. That top layer of skin is definitely going to physically protect us from our environment. It also can control permeability. Now this can be internal and external, but it's going to help keep what's in and what's out, and have more control over what passes back and forth. It can also provide sensation. So again, if we go back to the skin, we can certainly feel through the top layers of our skin, and produce specialized secretions. We talked about how that could be sweat or mucus, again, depending on where the epithelia is. So we said that epithelia was going to line and cover surfaces, and that tissues are made up of collections of cells. But those cells have to be able to stick to each other. So we're going to look at how these cells stick together to form sheets like they do in epithelia, and also some other main characteristics that we're going to see in epithelia that helps us to identify it apart from other tissue types. So epithelia is going to exhibit polarity by having an apical and basal surface. And what that means in English is a top and a bottom, essentially. And we'll also see an uneven distribution of organelles. So let's take a look at that in an image to help us better understand what the heck that means. So this is a representative of a clump of epithelia, and really it's just two cells that are stuck together in the epithelial sheet. And what you can see here is that there's definitely what looks like a top and a bottom. Now, of course, that's going to be, you might look at that differently, what's top and bottom, if we're talking about internally. But the apical surface is the surface that we see up here. If this were, for example, in the intestines, then the apical surface would face the hollow inside of the intestine. If this were from the skin, which it isn't, the apical surface would be what you touch if you're touching your own skin. So apical surface here, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes, and then down at the bottom we have the basal surface or basement, which kind of makes sense, right? So the basement of a house is underneath at the bottom, so here's the basal surface. Also, we said that epithelia in polarity has, in addition, an uneven distribution of organelles. Do you notice how we can see that almost all the mitochondria in this picture, almost all the mitochondria are down in the bottom of the cell. They're not spread evenly throughout the cell. They're found mostly at the bottom. We've also got a lot of open cytoplasm up here at the top. So the organelles are not equally distributed. They're kind of packed to one area in the cell. So that's something that we often see in epithelial tissue. So in addition, we're going to see cellularity, which means cell junctions. So in epithelial tissue, it's made up of a bunch of cells all connected to each other. They're not separate individual cells. They're all connected to each other, and we will show how they do that in some upcoming slides. The epithelia also attaches to a basement membrane, and the basement membrane we actually saw, this is it down here, basement membrane. This is what epithelia sticks to. And epithelia can regenerate. It is continuously replaced. So epithelia can also become specialized and is able to move fluid over itself. So when we see epithelia with cilia, for example, we know that cilia are for movement. They move fluids across the cell. So we would expect when we see cilia to think of movement right away. And epithelia can also move fluids through itself, which is called permeability. It can produce secretions. We talked about how those secretions will differ depending on where the epithelia is found. And repeating here, polarity. So we talked about the apical surface. We looked at it. Again, this is where the cell is exposed to an external or internal environment. We talked about the top of the skin would be the apical, or if we were discussing the lining of the intestine, the apical surface would be facing the hollow inside of the intestine. We talked about how cilia can move fluid across the cells, and microvilli, we talked about those in chapter 3. Their job is to increase surface area for absorption. So we're going to see microvilli in places where we're absorbing nutrients, perhaps, like in the small intestine. And we talked about the basal surface, which was the bottom, or where the epithelia sticks to the basement membrane. But there's also a basolateral surface. So this would be the bottom side where the cells connect their neighbors. So this here is the basal surface, and then if we include the side, that's basolateral. That's where these cells would connect their neighbors. And here is some microvilli up here. So this again, these are short little projections that don't move, and they're responsible for absorption. So the integrity of epithelia is maintained by some connections between cells, which we call intercellular connections. The epithelia is also attached to its basement membrane, which we looked at in the previous image. And the epithelia is able to maintain and repair itself. Now, this is not true for all tissues necessarily, or certainly not as easy for every tissue type, but epithelia is pretty great at repairing and maintaining itself. So how do those cells actually stick to one another to make sheets like we see in skin? They do it by intercellular connections. And these connections can either be for support or they can be for communication, and we'll see the difference as we go through the types. They are created by cell adhesion molecules, or CAMs, which are a type of protein that connect the cells at their membranes. Proteoglycan acts as an intercellular cement. So this is kind of like a glue that holds the cells together. Sticky substance. So the intercellular connections, there are 3 main ones we'll talk about, and I'll add a 4th on probably. gap junctions. We'll start with those. So gap junctions are openings between neighboring cells that will allow for rapid communication. These gap junctions are created by transmembrane proteins. So these are proteins that interlock two neighboring cells and these proteins allow for a little portal where molecules and ions can pass back and forth. So this allows the cells to communicate with one another. So this is what it would look like up close. So on the left here we have one cell membrane, and then this is a neighboring cell membrane. And in between, you can see these little openings, little hallways that lead from one cell over to the neighboring cell. So again, this allows the cells to communicate or talk back and forth and also share ions and molecules. So that again is a gap junction. Next on the list is the tight junctions. And tight junctions are between two plasma membranes as well. And we'll see in the tight junction what's called an adhesion belt. An adhesion belt is a protein belt that attaches to what's called a terminal web. And it'll certainly be easier for you to understand if I show you a picture of that. So hold that thought for 1 second. These tight junctions are going to help really pull tightly two cells together. And that's going to prevent the passage of water and solutes between cells. This will keep enzymes, acids, and waste in the lumen of the digestive tract. Okay, so that's just an example. But what that means is, if you think about your stomach and how your stomach actually has in it a very strong acid called hydrochloric acid. And hydrochloric acid is going to give your stomach a pH of about 1.5 to 2, which is highly, highly acidic. So that could burn through your tissues. So these tight junctions are so snug that the acid that is managed in the hollow inside of the stomach, which is called the lumen, is unable to seep in between the cells and get into deeper tissues where it could actually destroy those tissues. Okay, so in this picture, reviewing, here are some gap junctions. Right here, these guys allow for communication between neighboring cells. And then here are tight junctions. So tight junctions, and we're going to look at them up close. This would be a tight junction right here. And underneath it is the adhesion belt, which is a web of proteins that attach to the terminal web, which is this, again, more protein. So adhesion belt connected to terminal web. And this interlocks and links up all these proteins to keep the cell tightly together. Above that, or the cells tightly together, above that is the tight junction. So let's look at that up close. So here's the tight junction. So it's formed by the fusion of two plasma membranes. So here's one on the left and one on the right. And to me, it almost looks like they've been bolted together, nice and tightly. And then below, we have the adhesion belt. And this adhesion belt is tied to the terminal web, which again is a network of proteins, and this just gives further reinforcement. Okay? So next we have desmosomes. CAMs and proteoglycans link opposing plasma membranes. There are two kinds of desmosomes, spot and hemidesmosomes. Spot desmosomes tie skin cells or tie cells together like in the skin cells as an example. And this is why when you get a sunburn and you get blistered, your skin peels off in flakes or sheets because those individual cells are all connected by these desmosomes, so they come off as a group instead of individuals. These desmosomes are so nice and tight that it also allows for tissues to bend and twist without tearing. And hemidesmosomes, that was really the fourth one I wanted to add to the 3 that I initially gave you: gap junctions, tight junctions, and desmosomes, but we can technically stick it under the desmosome category. Hemidesmosomes attach cells to the basement membrane. So I like to think of those as more of a root system. So here is the spot desmosome, so the first type of the 2 types, and it looks a bit like, to me, that the 2 cells were zipped up, like maybe this is a little bit similar to a zipper. So on the left we have a plasma membrane, and on the right we have a plasma membrane, and these cams are interlocked, tying the 2 cells together. And this would be at the bottom, or the basal surface of the cell. These are the hemidesmosomes that anchor or root the cell down into the basement membrane. So that's what's going to keep the epithelia down and not slipping away from the underlying tissue. So the basement membrane is made up of 2 parts: the basal lamina, which is the topmost part that's closest to the epithelium, and the reticular lamina, which is the deeper portion of the basement membrane that gives it strength. So if we go back, we can take a look at that. So here's this whole thing is the basement membrane, and at the top, basal lamina, and at the bottom, reticular lamina. Epithelial cells, again, are great at maintenance and repair. They are replaced by a continual division of stem cells. These stem cells are located deep near the basement membrane. Now, to shift a little bit, we can classify epithelia based on its shape. So when we say classify, we mean name the epithelia. And the naming of epithelia is a 2-step process. We're going to name it based on the cell shapes, and we're going to name it based on how many layers we find in that particular epithelia. So let's start with shapes. So the shapes are, here's our 3 choices. We have squamous or squamous. These are thin, flat, and flaky. These cells are typically irregular, so one is going to look very different from another, but they're a bit like, some people describe them as like a fried egg, nice and thin, where the yolk will be where the nucleus is. The yolk is a little swollen where the nucleus is. Cuboidal is square or box shape like a cube. And columnar are tall, slender rectangles like columns. We also have the layering. There's only 2 to remember. Simple, which is 1 layer of cells. That's easy enough. And stratified, which would be 2 or more layers of cells. So this would be when the cells are stacked on top of one another. So let's look at some examples of this. So first we've got simple, squamous or squamous. And what we want to do first, or what I always tell myself, is find the basement membrane, which is going to be right here. So when we find the basement membrane, that's where the epithelia begins. So anything on top of that is considered epithelial tissue. Now, first we can say, is it simple or is it stratified? 1 layer, 2 layers, 3, or 20? So it's clearly 1 layer thick. So this is a simple epithelia. And the next thing we want to do is determine shape of the cells. Well, that definitely doesn't look like a column or rectangle. Definitely doesn't look like a cube or box. So it must be squamous, and it is. So we would name this simple squamous epithelium. Now looking over on the right, again, locate the basement membrane, which is here. Anything above it is considered epithelial tissue. Okay. So is it simple or stratified? Well, there's definitely more than 1 layer there, so it has to be stratified. So stratified, we got that. And then the next thing we're going to do is determine shape. Well, that seems a little scary because there's a lot of shapes there. So what do you do when you have stratified epithelia? Well, the rule is we name the tissue by the apical surface. So we're only going to look at the top surface to determine what type of epithelia we have. So the top surface shows that that's not a cube and it isn't a column. It's pretty thin. So that must be squamous or squamous. So we would call this stratified squamous epithelium. So it doesn't matter that there are some cubes down here. It doesn't matter if we even see some that are shaped a bit like columns. We only name it for the apical layer. So why would we have areas of the body that have 1 cell layer thick, simple, or multiple layers thick, stratified? So it's really a simple common sense answer. Anywhere on our bodies that could come into contact with something abrasive or close to, or any part of our body that comes in contact or close to the outside world needs to be stratified. So if it's on the outside or close to the outside, it's almost always going to be stratified. So some examples: skin. It's very likely you could bump, scratch, nick, or burn your skin, so it needs to be thick to withstand all of those possibilities. If our skin was only 1 cell layer thick or simple, we could bump into a pillow and bleed to death. So clearly that's not going to work for our survival. But it isn't just the outside. What about the lining of the nasal cavity? Can you reach it? Yeah, you could. So that needs to be stratified. What about the ear canal or the surface of the tongue? Stratified. Same thing with the urethra. That would also need to be stratified. It's close to the outside. So anything that opens up or communicates with the outside world or is on the outside is going to be stratified. Anything deep inside the body and well protected can be simple. So the lining of the stomach or the lining of the alveolar sacs in the lungs, very deep, very well protected, definitely can be simple. Another reason we might want to have simple epithelia is because of absorption or diffusion. So if you want to absorb nutrients, like in the small intestine, you don't want to have to absorb nutrients across 50 layers of cells. That would be extremely difficult. So by having simple epithelia, we can absorb very quickly and get those nutrients on in. Same thing in the alveolar sacs of the lungs, which are simple epithelia. We want to be able to get oxygen and CO2 across that thin layer as quickly as possible. So simple is very helpful in that situation. So looking at some more examples. So here we're going to look for the basement membrane. What's above it? 1 layer. Definitely simple. Looking at the shape, clearly box or cube shaped. So this would be simple cuboidal epithelium. Here, basement membrane, 2 layers, so we know this is stratified. And then when we look at the shape, we're going to look at the apical surface because we've got more than 1 layer. Those are definitely cubes, so stratified cuboidal epithelia. Next we have columnar. So if we find the basement membrane and look above it, definitely simple, definitely column shaped. So this would be simple columnar epithelium. Basement membrane, looking above, we can see multiple layers, so that's stratified. Remember, we always go to the apical surface to determine the shape. Those are definitely columns, stratified, columnar, epithelium. Okay, so as we move on to the next, reviewing squamous or squamous epithelia. Simple squamous is good for absorption and diffusion. Stratified squamous will protect against mechanical stresses. So anything that's close to the outside or on the outside will be stratified. Okay, so here's some actual real body examples, not just drawings of the different types. So this is an example of simple squamous epithelium. You can see the irregular, flaky, thin shape. And in the cross section, we can see that it is only 1 layer thick. Here's the actual light microscope picture. And because this is simple, we know it's going to be deep inside the body and well protected. And it is. This is actually taken from the lining of the peritoneal cavity in the abdomen. So here is another image. If we start at the basement membrane, we can see that that is clearly stratified. And we look at the top surface to determine what the shape is. And it is definitely squamous or squamous, so we would call that stratified squamous epithelium. Because it is so thick, we would expect to find this somewhere close to the outside of the body. And if you look, it is in fact taken from the surface of the tongue, so that makes sense. Cuboidal, simple cuboidal epithelia is for secretion and absorption. Same rule as the simple squamous. We can find it in glands and portions of the kidney. Stratified cuboidal is more rare, but we do see it in the ducts of sweat glands and also mammary glands. So here's a real-life image of simple cuboidal. Again, you can see it's only 1 cell layer thick, and the cells are cube or box shaped. So simple cuboidal. Because it is simple, we would expect to find it deep inside the body, and we do. We find it in the kidney. Here is a stratified cuboidal epithelium. So we find the basement membrane. Here's the hollow inside, known as the lumen of the gland. And we can see multiple layers, so that's easy to tell it's stratified. And then we locate the apical surface. Remember, apical means that it faces an internal or external environment. If it's on the outside, it would be the top layer of skin. If it's the inside, it faces the lumen. So here's the lumen. And these are cube shaped. They're a little squished, but they're cube shaped. So this is stratified cuboidal epithelium. And this is from a sweat gland, which is in the skin. So we could bump or scratch that. So it makes sense that it needs to have more than 1 layer. Now this one's kind of a wild card. We have 2 of those. This one doesn't really fit into any other category as far as shape. This one's just special, so kind of consider it its own little thing. Transitional epithelia. So transitional epithelia is going to tolerate stretching without tearing. And it looks different as it stretches. The cells will flatten out when we stretch it. And a really great place to find this is in the bladder. And if you think about it, that makes a whole lot of sense because the bladder has to stretch a lot, multiple times a day, over your lifetime. So this is an empty bladder, and the lining of the bladder is transitional epithelia, which is this. And you can see that it's nice and tall, very, very stacked up. This is a full bladder, and when the bladder fills, it stretches. So you can see that the transitional epithelia has kind of thinned out because it's being stretched. So again, transitional epithelia can stretch without tearing, and it's its own little category. Alright, so our last group are the columnar. And the columnar epithelia can be, of course, simple or stratified, like we talked about, but then we've got a weird one in there called pseudo-stratified. So we'll come back to that one. Let's go first with the two obvious ones. So simple columnar is when we have one cell layer thick, and simple columnar is going to be found in lining the stomach, small intestine, and large intestine, and it's really great for absorption and secretion. Stratified columnar epithelia means multiple layers of columns, and it is relatively rare, and you'll find it in the pharynx, anus, and urethra. So let's take a look at what those look like. So here's simple columnar. We find the basement membrane and look above it. You can see it's only one cell layer thick, so that would be simple, and the shape is clearly column. So simple columnar epithelia. Because it is simple, we know it's going to be found deep inside the body where it can't get bumped, nicked, or scratched. And this is taken from the lining of the small intestine. Another little hint it might have been in the intestine is the microvilli. Microvilli are for absorption, and that the intestines is where we absorb 90% of our nutrients. Okay, so this is our stratified columnar. So let's take a look. We'll find the basement membrane right there. And we can see there are multiple layers, so that's definitely stratified. And then we look at shapes. So we're always going to look at the apical surface, which is clearly columnar. So this would be stratified columnar epithelia. And this one is taken from the salivary gland duct, which is close to the surface. So here's our other weird one, its own little wild card as well. It's called pseudo-stratified columnar epithelia, because at first, when you look at it, we find the basement membrane. It looks like it's stratified. Looks like you can see some small cells at the bottom and some larger cells on top, but it really isn't stratified. It's actually simple. If you look closely, every one of these cells is in contact with the basement membrane. Now it's a little difficult to see in this particular image, but like this little guy right here is blocking our view, but this cell behind is actually touching the basement membrane too. So every cell we see in this image, they're all squeezed and kind of distorted, but every one of them is in touch with the basement membrane, which means they are not stacked, they are one layer. It's again a little difficult to see in this image, but that's the definition of pseudo-stratified. It looks stratified, but it really isn't. It's not true stratification. All the cells are touching the basement membrane, which means we have one layer. And we're going to find this in parts of the respiratory system. Okay, so moving on to finish up epithelia. Epithelia can also have glands. And when we say that they can have glands, it means that depending on where the epithelia is, the glands are going to be present and they're going to be different as far as what they produce. This is one of the hallmarks of epithelia. Epithelia is also what we call avascular. Avascular in that it does not have any blood supply, any direct blood supply. So epithelial tissue must get all nutrients by way of diffusion of nutrients into it and diffusion of waste out of it, because it does not have any of its own vascularization. So if you were to cut the very tip-top layer of your skin, it would not bleed because it does not have any blood vessels. Now, if we cut down a little further, we bleed because we've cut into connective tissue. But the very top is avascular. So epithelial tissue, again, avascular. That's one of its hallmarks that makes it different from the other types of tissues. Okay, so glands are collections of epithelial cells that produce secretions. Endocrine glands release hormones that enter the bloodstream. There are no ducts involved with endocrine glands, and we'll talk about the endocrine system when we get to Chapter 18, which is part of Anatomy 2 material. Exocrine glands produce exocrine secretions through a duct. So that's what we're going to focus on now because those are part of epithelia. So there are three methods of secretion: merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. Merocrine secretion is when a gland secretes a product by way of exocytosis. Now that word should be familiar. We talked about it in Chapter 3. That is when we use a secretory vesicle to expel a product out of the cell. And an example of a gland like this would be a salivary gland or a merocrine sweat gland. So this is what it would look like. So in the salivary gland, for example, here are the epithelial cells that would line the gland, and saliva is being produced and packaged into these secretory vesicles, which will head to the membrane, and then the saliva will be ejected by way of exocytosis. Next, we have apocrine secretion, and apocrine secretion is when we release a product, but we also shed cytoplasm with the product. And an example of that would be a mammary gland. So looking here, this is from the mammary gland, and these are the cells that line the mammary gland. So we have a cell here with secretory vesicles filled with milk, and instead of just ejecting the milk, the whole top part of the cell pinches off and cytoplasm is released with the product, which in this case is milk. The cell regenerates and produces more milk and then begins to pinch off again, and we will begin the cycle again. So we release the product with cytoplasm. That's an apocrine secretion. Holocrine is the last, and holocrine secretion is released by cells bursting, which kills the cells. The cells will be replaced by stem cells, so they'll make new ones right after these are killed. And an example of this is a sebaceous gland, which is also known as an oil gland. So let's take a look at that hologram. So here is the lining of an oil gland, and here are the cells that would be found in the oil gland. You can see the cells at the bottom are undergoing mitosis. We're making new cells because we know the ones on top are going to die. So we're regenerating. The cells on top have secretory vesicles filled with oil, which is what we're making in this gland. And when the oil is ready to be released, the whole cell bursts open and dumps out its contents, which is a mixture of oil and also all the cell guts or innards of the cell. But that's okay, these cells are dying as they release their oil because we've got new ones being produced that will push right on up, and then they will burst, and the cycle will continue again and again and again. So the types of secretions produced by exocrine glands, remember exocrine glands have ducts. We have serous glands that produce watery secretions, mucus glands which produce mucus secretions, and mixed exocrine glands that produce both serous and mucus. Okay, so the next tissue after epithelial that we're going to spend some time talking about is connective tissue. And connective tissue is what it sounds like. It connects the epithelia to underlying tissues. Connective tissue is highly vascular. So if you remember, an epithelial tissue, it was avascular, no blood supply, no direct blood supply. In connective tissue, there is a ton of blood vessels. So connective tissue is a little different. It is not completely cells, just like we said epithelia was made up of cells connected to one another. Connective tissue is made with three things: specialized cells, and I'll give you some examples of which ones we're talking about, extracellular protein fibers, I'll give you some examples of that as well, and then those two things will be suspended in what's called the ground substance. Matrix is the last two items, protein fibers and the ground substance. So if we combine those two, we can refer to that as the matrix. So the matrix made up of ground substance and protein fibers. The matrix makes up the majority of the tissue volume and will also help to determine the specialized function of the tissue. So let's take a look at that a little bit deeper. So this is another illustration taken from my book, and I feel that this is a helpful illustration because it gives you an everyday example of how the matrix and the cells work. So you know those awful, in my opinion, molded Jell-O salads that people make sometimes, where you've got Jell-O and you've got fruit mixed into the Jell-O? Well, this is similar to how connective tissue works. So in this drawing, the Jell-O in the background, all of this space here, that represents the matrix. The matrix, remember, is made up of ground substance. That's can be fluid or it can be gelatinous like this. And it could also be hard, depending on what tissue we're talking about. So this would be the matrix, the Jell-O. And then these are the individual pieces of fruit. These represent the cells. So if you notice in the Jell-O, the cells are suspended in the matrix. So in epithelial tissue, it was a bunch of cells. But in connective tissue, we have cells, or fruit in our example, floating around in a matrix. That again is what the cells are suspended in, which in this example would be like the Jell-O. So very different from epithelial tissue, which is just cells. Now we're going to go through some examples of connective tissue. And the connective tissue, remember, there are many kinds. So in each kind, we're going to talk about the jello or the matrix and what its consistency is. So it can be liquid, it can be gelatinous like this, or it could be rubbery or hard. And then the fruit will also change, the cells. So in some tissues we'll have certain kinds of cells, and in other tissues we'll have other kinds of cells. So we're going to be specific about that as we go through our examples. So in general, if we're not getting specific about a particular type of tissue, connective tissue has multiple important functions. It can give us structure for the body. It can be used to transport fluids and other dissolved materials. It can protect your organs, support, surround, and interconnect other types of tissue. That's one of the reasons it's named connective. It can store energy, especially triglycerides, which is a type of lipid, and can defend the body from invading microorganisms like bacteria. So we can divide connective tissue into three big groups. We have the first called connective tissue proper. This one can be used to connect and protect. We'll talk about some examples. We then have fluid connective tissue, which is going to be used for transport, and supporting connective tissue, which is used for structure and strength. So here's another quick chart from the study guide, and this is basically showing the three categories that we're going to find in connective tissue. So again, on the far left, connective tissue proper, and we're going to talk about that one first, and there are two types, loose and dense. We then have fluid connective tissue. There are two types, blood and lymph. And then third, we have supporting connective tissue. There are two types, cartilage and bone. So let's go back to connective tissue proper and focus in on that one all by itself. So connective tissue proper, again, can either be loose or dense. Loose connective tissue has more ground substance and fewer fibers. So I like to think of it as a little bit squishy. So as it says, there's more ground substance, not as many fibers, so it is going to be very loose and squishy. An example of this would be fat tissue or adipose, which we certainly know feels quite squishy, unfortunately. And then dense connective tissue is going to have more fibers. So more long stringy fibers running through it. We're going to talk about what those fibers are as we get a little further. There's less ground substance in this, so it is going to be a little bit more sturdy. An example would be a tendon, tendons being the tough tissue that connects muscle to bone. So in connective tissue proper, remember the rule. So the rule is that all connective tissues must have three items. 1, specialized cells. 2, fibers. And 3, ground substance. Remember that fibers and ground substance are what we call the matrix collectively. So this is a list of the main specialized cells that we will see in connective tissue proper. So depending on the tissue, you may see some of these, all of these, or even just one type in the tissue. But we're going to go ahead and get acquainted with all of these so that we recognize when we hear a specific tissue, we recognize the cells that are in that specific tissue. So first we have fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are the most abundant cell type, so we're going to see a lot of those in connective tissue proper. And they are helpful in secreting protein to keep the ground substance thick or viscous. So when we hear the word viscous, we should think of syrupy. Syrupy, sort of like the consistency of honey or maple syrup. So nice and thick, but still pourable. Fibrocytes are the second most abundant type of cell, and they help to maintain the connective tissue fibers of connective tissue proper. Adipocytes, these are just fat cells. Mesenchymal cells are stem cells that respond to injury or infection, and they're going to do that by dividing. Melanocytes are going to produce the brown pigment melanin. Macrophages are large, that's what the macro part means. Phage is from the word phagocytic. Phagocytic means to engulf or eat. So these are large phagocytic cells. They're part of the immune system, and their job is to eat pathogens and damaged cells. Mast cells will stimulate inflammation after injury or infection, and inflammation is just increased blood flow to an area. And this happens because of the release of histamine, which will enhance inflammation, and also heparin. So heparin is an anticoagulant. In other words, it helps prevent blood from clotting to enhance blood flow. So this is important when we're trying to repair an area. Lymphocytes can develop into plasma cells which produce antibodies. So these defend against infection. Macrophages are small blood cells that are phagocytic. So they too engulf pathogens and other things that can enter the tissue. So those were our specialized cells, and remember that all connective tissues must have, again, number 1, specialized cells. Number 2, they've got to have fibers. So this is our list of fibers. The 3 main fibers we're going to see in connective tissue are collagen, reticular, and elastic fibers. So looking first at collagen, it's the most common fiber in connective tissue proper. It is long, straight, and unbranched. They look like strands, and I'll show you some pictures of these things. It's very strong and very flexible. So you're going to find collagen in the skin. That's what gives our skin bounce and elasticity. But as we get older, that starts to break down, and our skin gets a bit less bouncy and can begin to sag or wrinkle. It can resist force well in one direction, so collagen can be torn if we stretch an area too far. And we do see a lot of it, we mentioned the skin, but we see a lot of it in tendons and also ligaments. So they're going to be able to withstand quite a bit of pulling and stretching. Reticular fibers form a network of interwoven fibers. So these guys look a bit more like a net when you see them in the tissue. They're strong and flexible, and they can actually resist force in many directions because they are interwoven. We find reticular fibers in sheaths that surround organs. Elastic fibers contain the protein elastin. They are branched, not quite as branched as reticular. Reticular looks more like a web or a net because it's interwoven, but elastin has branches but doesn't quite look like a net. It returns to original length after you stretch it, and some examples would be the elastic ligaments of vertebrae, which are very tough. So that was the second thing we're going to see in connective tissue proper, but we also are going to have that ground substance, which is, remember, the jello. In the example of the jello salad, that's what the cells and fibers are suspended in. And like we mentioned, ground substance, depending on where we are in the body, is going to vary from liquid to gel to rubbery to hard. And so in this image, this is an example of connective tissue proper, and you can see several of the things we talked about in the last few slides. So for one thing, we can see some of the specialized cells we spoke of. So we've got the melanocyte here. That's the one that makes the brown pigment melanin. Here's our plasma cell, macrophage, mast cell, lymphocyte, mesenchymal cell, adipocyte, fibrocyte. So those are all examples of things we might see in connective tissue proper. We see all of those that we just went over in this one tissue. We've also got our fibers, so that's the second thing we find in connective tissue. Here's the reticular fibers. It looks like a net. Then we have long, branched, elastic fibers. And these yellow striped ones, those are collagen. So what do you think that would mean the pink stuff is in the background? What the cells are suspended in? That would be the ground substance. So ground substance again is a clear, colorless, and viscous. Viscous again means syrupy, and it's going to fill the space between cells and slow pathogen movement. Loose connective tissues, we gave examples, or we said that there was, for connective tissue proper, loose and dense. Loose connective tissue can act as a packing material, filling space between organs, cushioning cells, and supporting epithelia. So let's take a look at some examples of loose connective tissue proper. So remember we said this is going to be a little bit squishy in texture. So one example of loose connective tissue proper would be embryonic connective tissue, which is very soft. So this is going to be found in the embryo, not in adults. The mesenchyme is an embryonic connective tissue. That is the first tissue to appear in the embryo, the first connective tissue to appear in the embryo, and it's going to give rise to all the other connective tissues. Mucous connective tissue is also a loose embryonic connective tissue and can be found in the umbilical cord, a very soft tissue. So here's a picture of embryonic mesenchyme. And what we can see here is these mesenchymal cells. So those are the specialized cells in embryonic mesenchyme. And then in the background, we have ground substance, which, because this is loose connective tissue, we can expect that it will be very syrupy and not at all hard. This is a picture of mucous connective tissue, which is also referred to as Wharton's jelly, and it can be found in the umbilical cord. We see again mesenchymal cells, and in the background, a very soft, gelatinous ground substance. So some connective tissue we find in adults would be areolar, adipose, and reticular. Areolar tissue is the least specialized, has an open framework, and a very syrupy ground substance. There are elastic fibers in it. That's one of the fibers we're going to see mainly. And it will help to hold capillary beds. So in adults we find this, or not necessarily adults, but not an embryo, we find this under the skin. So the areolar tissue separates the skin from the muscle. So when you pinch your skin, you are not also pinching the muscle. The areolar tissue separates the two. So here's a picture of areolar tissue. And we said an example, you can find it in other places, but an example would be under the skin. And what we can see in it is it does very much look like a connective tissue. It's not all cells. We see some specialized cells here, scattered about, some collagen, and in the background we have our ground substance. Adipose tissue, or fat, contains many adipocytes, so that's going to be its main specialized cell. Adipocytes in adults do not divide. So when we gain weight, adipocytes expand to store fat. So they become more swollen, which makes us look a little thicker. And then if we lose some weight, the adipocytes shrink as fat is released. So here's a picture of adipose tissue, and it is going to be filled with large adipocytes. Here are the individual cells, and then if you look in between, we see what we also should expect, ground substance. And we're still in loose connective tissue, so the ground substance will be viscous. Reticular tissue provides support and contains a lot of reticular fibers, which is why it's named reticular tissue. These reticular fibers will form a complex three-dimensional stroma, which means a net, and this will support cells of organs. So here's a picture of reticular tissue, and this can be taken, for example, from around the liver. And you can see in it there are some specialized cells, some lavender colored ground substance, which would still be viscous, but a lot of dark purple reticular fibers creating a web or a net. So this will help this tissue to provide a supporting framework. So that concludes loose connective tissue proper and brings us to dense connective tissue proper. So dense connective tissue proper is going to be what it sounds like, dense. There's going to be a lot more fibers in it, which is going to make it a little tougher and a little less squishy. It can also be called collagenous tissue because it has a lot of collagen. There are three types of dense connective tissue: dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Dense regular connective tissue is tightly packed and all of the collagen is parallel. So that means nice and neat, and every collagen fiber runs in the same direction. So it's a regular pattern, which is why we call it regular. We're going to find this in tendons that attach muscle to bone. We're going to find it in ligaments that connect one bone to another and help to stabilize organs. And we'll also find it in aponeuroses, which are tendons, but they are big tendinous sheets that will attach a broad, flat muscle to another structure. And we're going to find one of those right on top of the skull. So if you take a look at a picture of a muscular view of the head and neck, you will see a nice big flat aponeurosis going across the top of the skull. So here's a great view of why we call it regular, dense regular connective tissue. So if you see here, we can see some specialized cells in there, these little dark nuclei of the fibroblast. But mainly what we see is a ton of fibers. You can't even see the ground substance here because there's so many fibers. These are collagen, and if you notice, they're all running in the exact same direction, parallel, which is why it's called regular, because it has a nice, neat, organized pattern. So next we have dense, irregular connective tissue, and this is going to have collagen fibers running in every which direction, so not organized. Instead, it's interwoven and forms a network. This kind of tissue, dense irregular, is much tougher than dense regular because of the interweaving pattern of collagen. It provides strength to the dermis, which is part of your skin. This is why you can pull on your skin and kind of yank on it in every which way and let go of it and it bounces right back. That is partially because of that collagen, it gives the dermis lots of strength and stretchiness. It will also form the protective sheaths that we find around cartilage and bone, which we'll talk about more when we get to those chapters, and forms capsules around certain organs, like the liver, kidneys, and spleen. They all have capsules around them to protect them. Dense irregular connective tissue is a large proponent of those capsules. So here's a picture of dense irregular, and again, an example taken from the dermis of the skin, which is the second big layer down. And you can see that the collagen runs in every which direction. There is no parallel running of fibers. It is not organized. It forms an interwoven network. So that's why we call it irregular. Elastic tissue is made of elastic fibers, and an example would be the elastic ligaments of the vertebrae. So it's very organized. You can see that it's mostly parallel here, but what's different about this than dense regular is that it's made of elastic fibers, not collagen. So remember, elastic fibers are branched and they are a little bit stretchier. So this is going to give them a good stretchy toughness that is a great support for the spinal vertebrae. Alright, so that ends connective tissue proper and brings us straight into our next one, which is fluid connective tissue. And fluid connective tissue is what it sounds like. It's going to be a liquid, which is kind of weird because most of the time when we think of tissues, probably we're thinking of something solid. But fluid connective tissue is going to be a fluid just like it sounds like. And there are two examples, blood and lymph. Blood contains a watery matrix. So the ground substance in blood is going to be liquid, and there are some dissolved proteins in the blood. So that watery matrix of plasma is going to contain ground substance and dissolved proteins, but in this example that matrix is going to be liquidy or watery. So we're no longer a gel like we were in loose connective tissue, a gel or a viscous solution. We are now watery, and it contains cells and cell fragments collectively known as formed elements. So the main cells we're going to find in blood, so these would be our specialized cells that are suspended in the matrix called plasma. We have red blood cells, which are also known as erythrocytes, and white blood cells, which are known as leukocytes. So red blood cells are what's going to carry oxygen around the body. White blood cells help to fight infection, and platelets are used for clotting. So here are red blood cells, and again they're called erythrocytes, and they make up about half the volume of blood, and they are what gives blood its red color. Lymph is the second type of fluid connective tissue, and it forms as an interstitial fluid, which is a tissue fluid that enters the lymphatic vessels. And so the lymphatic vessels are vessels that go all around the body, similar to your blood vessels, and they carry lymphatic fluid. And lymphatic fluid is a watery fluid, so a watery matrix, and it contains specialized cells like white blood cells that help to fight infection. So it is monitored and part of the immune system. So that ends fluid connective tissue and brings us into supporting connective tissue. And supporting connective tissue includes cartilage and bone. Those are the two groups. Cartilage provides shock absorption and protection. So we're going to see it in between the bones at the joints. We also see it in between the discs of the vertebrae, and we see it in the tip of the nose and in the ears, for example. Cartilage has a matrix that is a firm gel. So cartilage is a little bit more sturdy. So we're going to have a gel, a firm gel here, not viscous, not watery, but a firm gel. And that gel contains a polysaccharide derivative called chondroitin sulfate. And that's going to help to give the matrix its firmness. The cells, specialized cells that are suspended in that matrix, are called chondrocytes, which is a cartilage cell. There are three main types of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. So looking at hyaline first, it is the most common type of cartilage. It's tough and flexible, sort of. It helps to reduce friction between bones and is found in the synovial joints. So those would be the joints we often think of, things like the shoulder, hip, elbow, knee. In addition, we also find it on the tips of the ribs, the sternum, and helping to make up the trachea. Elastic cartilage is supportive, but it bends really well. It's probably the most bendable type of cartilage we have, and this is what's found in the tip of the nose and in the ear. So you can ball your ear up and let it go, and it bounces right back. Fibrocartilage is very durable and tough. It limits movement, but prevents bone-to-bone contact. And we're going to find this in certain joints, between the pubic bones and also between the vertebrae, making up the discs. So taking a look at some examples, we have hyaline cartilage first. This is the one that's very common, and we find it lining synovial joints. So this would be the shoulder. And here you can see what it would look like under a microscope. There's a lot of gel matrix, firm gel, remember, not liquidy. And then the chondrocytes are the specialized cells. Elastic cartilage, like in the ear, is going to be similar. We're still going to have a matrix, and we're still going to have chondrocytes, but what we've added here are elastic fibers, which is what makes this cartilage a lot more bendable. Fibrocartilage is very tough because it has interwoven collagen. We can see chondrocytes here, and then we can see the matrix is filled with lots and lots of fibers, which makes this very tough, and it can withstand compression. So we find this in between the vertebrae, making up the intervertebral discs. Okay, and supporting connective tissue also includes bone. We are not going to talk a lot about bone yet. We are going to do that in great detail in Chapter 6. So right now we're just going to give a little information, but not too much yet. So bone is also known as osseous tissue, and it is great for weight support and also protection of vital organs. It is very hard, so the matrix of bone is rigid, which makes sense because bones are rigid. And it's made rigid by calcium salt. It also has in it, in addition to the calcium salt in the matrix, we will find flexible collagen fibers. And that makes bone resistant to shattering. So we've got calcium and collagen making up the matrix. And then we've got the specialized cells, which in this instance would be bone cells, called osteocytes. Okay, so here's a picture of what bone would look like, and we'll talk a lot more about this in Chapter 6, but we can see that this matrix looks very rigid, looks very hard, made up of calcium salt and collagen, and then we can see some little cells that are kind of pinkish. Those are the specialized cells, osteocytes, suspended in that matrix. Alright, so that ends connective tissue. 3 categories: connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissue, and supporting connective tissue, and brings us into membranes. So membranes are physical barriers that line or cover body surfaces. They are made of epithelia supported by connective tissue. So now we know what both of those are, so we can talk about membranes. There are 4 types of membranes: mucous, serous, cutaneous, and synovial. So we'll start first with mucous membranes. These are going to line passageways that communicate with the outside of your body. So they'll be found in the digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. So for example, anything that communicates with the outside world. Your nose, your mouth, your urethra, all communicate with the outside world. These epithelial surfaces must be moist to reduce friction or to help with absorption or secretion, depending on where we are, which mucous tissue we're talking about. And so, of course, they are going to produce mucus. So mucous membranes are coated with the secretion of mucus glands, and these membranes are going to be found again in the digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. And what you're looking at here, just to practice in this particular tissue, here's our basement membrane. So anything above that is epithelia. Anything below it would be connective tissue, which we just talked about. So this would be simple columnar, wouldn't it? 1 layer thick, column shaped. There's kind of a weird looking cell here in this picture, and that's called a goblet cell. Goblet cells produce mucus, which is what this delicious looking stuff is right here. That mucus is ejected and moves across the surface of the tissue because of these little hair-like thingies, which are probably called cilia. Serous membranes line cavities that do not open to the outside. So they're going to be found in sealed internal body cavities. They're thin and they produce fluid to reduce friction. So we call it serous fluid that reduces friction. So this is going to keep all the organs all slippery so that as they move and flex inside, there's no friction. So here's what a serous membrane would look like in cross-section. So again, basement membrane. So all of this would be connective tissue below the basement. Above the basement, we have epithelia. And this would be simple squamous, right? Nice, thin, and flaky. And we're producing serous fluid, which lubricates the surface of the serous membrane and reduces friction. So we'll find this lining body cavities like in the abdomen, which is where the peritoneal cavity is, in the lung cavities, which is called the pleural, and the pericardial cavity, which is where we would find the heart. Cutaneous membrane, also known as skin, that covers your body, is thick, relatively water resistant, and usually pretty dry. Synovial membranes line synovial joint cavities, and when we move, this will stimulate production of synovial or joint fluid to lubricate the joint. So here's a visual of the skin. Basement membrane. So that would mean this is connective tissue. And anything above the basement membrane would be epithelial. Taking a look at it, I think it's clear that it is definitely stratified. And remember, when we have stratification, we name the tissue by looking at the top surface only, which we call the apical surface. That is clearly squamous, so we would call this stratified squamous epithelium. And we would find this close to the surface because of all the stratification. And we do because this is the skin. so it certainly would be on the surface and need lots of protection. Okay, so here is a synovial membrane, and this represents a joint. Here's one bone, here's another bone, and this is the joint capsule. And lining the joint capsule in red is the synovial membrane. Synovial membrane produces synovial or joint fluid, which would be found all in here, and that is also going to reduce friction in the joint. Okay, so finally we have muscle tissue, and muscle tissue is specialized for contraction. So again, we are not going to talk a lot about muscle tissue now because we do have a chapter on it coming up in chapter 10. So we're just going to give some bullet points on muscle tissue as an introduction. It's specialized for contraction, and there are three main types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal muscle tissue consists of long, thin fibers, which we call muscle fibers, and the cells do not divide. We also refer to them as striated, which means they have a striped appearance, and they are voluntary, which means you choose when you would like to use your skeletal muscles. So here's a picture of skeletal muscle cells. And you can see they are long and thin, and they have a striped appearance, which we call striations. They are voluntary, which means you choose when you would like to use them, and they are found on the skeleton, hence the name skeletal. So a bicep would be a good example of a skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle tissue is regulated by pacemaker cells, and which means that it is involuntary, so you do not control when your heart beats. The cells look branched, and they also are striated, so they do have a striped appearance as well. And again, involuntary. We do not choose when our heart beats. So here is cardiac muscle tissue found only in the heart, hence the name cardiac. The cells are branched and striped. And we can also remember, hopefully, that they are run by a pacemaker. So next we have smooth muscle tissue, which is found lining hollow organs. So that would mean things like the stomach, the intestines, the esophagus, the bladder, the uterus. These cells are small and spindle-shaped. They can divide and regenerate. And they are non-striated, so no stripes, which makes them look nice and smooth. And they too are involuntary, so we do not control when our stomach, intestines, or bladder spasm or contract. So this is a picture of smooth muscle, short, little, squished, spindle shape, no stripes, and they too are involuntary, so we do not control, and are found lining hollow organs. So finally we have nervous tissue, and again we're not going to say much about this yet either because we have a chapter 12, that will go over nervous tissue in great detail. Nervous tissue is specialized for conducting electrical impulses. It's concentrated in the brain and the spinal cord. We have nerves as well. And the two main types of cells we're going to see in nervous tissue are neurons, which send and receive signals, and neuroglia, which are supporting or helper cells. Tissues can respond to injury in two stages: inflammation, so that's when we increase blood flow to an area, and regeneration, to restore normal function. As we age, the speed and effectiveness of tissue regeneration decreases with age, and that is because of the slowing of repair and maintenance activities that comes with age, hormonal alterations, and reduced physical activity. The chemical and structural tissue changes can cause thinner epithelia as we age, fragile connective tissue, increased bruising, brittle bones, cardiovascular disease, and also mental deterioration. This concludes Chapter 4, A Study of Tissues, and we will begin next in Chapter 5, which will go over the integumentary system.